I'm here. My name is Jerry Gordon. I am a senior editor at the New English Review. I'm here with our esteemed colleague, retired US Army Brigadier General John Adams, a noted geopolitical and diplomatic expert. And we're here to discuss the amazing fall of the al-Assad regime and the impact on the so-called axis of resistance allegedly formed by Iran, which now looks in tatters, to be quite honest about it. And there's important things that both the US, under the forthcoming Trump administration, has to deal with as regards certain promises made, even during that administration, to support of one of the important allies that we have in a fight against Salafist terrorist groups in the Middle East, and that's the Kurds. Let's start at the beginning. General, why did the 54-year-long al-Assad regime fall so quickly to Syrian rebels in less than a week, ironically led by a US global former al-Qaeda terrorist leader who has the nom de plume, it's not his real name, of Abu Mohammad al-Jolani, who had a $10 million US bounty on his head? What's the story?
First of all, thank God that he fell. Baruch Hashem. We will not miss Assad if he's even alive. And I have questions about that too. But I would be remiss in not asking God's blessings on the IDF, on the state of Israel, on the Israeli people, and on the world Jewish community, which I think will be the beneficiary from these latest developments. May Hashem bless them, bless us as his people, and give us strength and the determination to continue to honor God and to be victorious against these evil people, including the Assad regime and its henchmen. Why did al-Jolani why was he successful, aside from the fact that God helped? God revenged himself on Assad for all of the things that he has done over the Assad regime has been doing since the early 1970s. I think 54 years.
54 years is right, correct.
And it was an awful period for everybody. But I think the regime was hollow. They had little support, even among their own people. Most of the Alawites, from which the Assad family stems, the Alawites are their tribal location is in the northwest of Syria, around Latakia. And they certainly weren't dominant in the Syrian armed forces, and they were a very small minority, maybe 10% at most within the country. So although Assad and his family had carefully placed Assad loyalists and Alawites in positions of power for this last 54 years, it was a very hollow and very vulnerable regime. So when there was opposition to the Assad family, it overwhelmed the number of people that had been placed in the regime, and all it took is a spark and some determined opposition to overthrow the Assad family, and as you can tell, it lasted less than 2 weeks. I have personal familiarity with Aleppo, having visited there. Visit's probably not the right word, but I was there it wasn't a diplomatic mission. It was a mission that I had gone on at the behest of a member of Congress who had asked me to go and talk to the Syrian Liberation Army leadership in Aleppo and find out what they wanted in terms of weaponry from the
Mhm.
West, not just the US, but from the West writ large. So that was my mission, is to go and talk to, in this case, a Syrian army defected colonel who was in charge of the Aleppo military district in 2013 and 2014, who I think is no longer with us. But he was in charge of the Aleppo military district until about 2017, and then he dropped off the map, which means he's probably gone. But Colonel Abdul Jabbar al-Okadi, interesting name, was quite an interesting character, and he crossed the border of Syria into Turkey to meet with me. And again, the mission was to find out what support he would want. And he told me a lot about what was going on in Aleppo during that time. It was terrible. And the regime, the Syrian regime, with the cooperation of Russians, was destroying everything that had any positive use for the Syrian people in Aleppo, which was not not an Alawite area. It was Sunni Muslims, and they destroyed everything. So why would the people rise up against these terrible people, the Alawites and their Russian allies? Was because they were hated. And so given the opportunity to resist and fight, led by apparently a charismatic leader like al-Jolani, whose name, interestingly enough, means that his family's from, or he's taken on the name of somebody from the Golan. Hard to know where he's actually from, but al-Jolani in Arabic means from the Golan. But al-Jolani apparently was a charismatic figure, is a charismatic figure, was able to seize power among these really disparate group of regime opposition forces and put together a resistance that overcame this hollow regime that was supporting the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. Thank God. So successful because, one, the regime was hollow. Two, the opposition was primed to conduct a battle against them, and it moved like lightning through the entire country, from Aleppo to Homs to Hama to Damascus, and it was days between the fall of all those cities, from north to south.
But having said that, al-Jolani has an interesting background. His father apparently was an economist, of all things. Family were fairly secular until his teen years, when obviously in the wake of the quote, Arab Spring, he lit out for, of all places, Iraq. And he marinated essentially in what I would consider as the Salafist doctrine among the Sunnis in Iraq. And there he was, I guess, captured at one point and was put into the infamous Camp Bucca in Iraq, which was loaded with Salafists, and in particular, an individual by the name of al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi, you may recall, was the fomenter of ISIS in Iraq. And curiously, as I recall, what happened to al-Baghdadi is that the US took him out in his house, which interestingly lay bestride northern Syria and Turkey, which always gave rise to the question of whether or not there was tacit interaction support from, let's say, the intelligence service of Turkey and him as well. But the other aspect of our friend al-Jolani was that he apparently got his spurs in terms of the administration, essentially, of the Aleppo province, the Idlib province, as it's known. And that was sort of the wind at his back in the context of how he handled things. He also apparently made it evident that he was not going to attack the minorities, particularly the religious minorities, the Syriac Christians who were there, and others. But that may be small comfort if he truly reveals what his agenda is like later in terms of the administration of the place. But he leads the Hayar Tahrir Al-Sham, the HTS as it's known, which itself was a derivative of a prior al-Qaeda group that fundamentally, yeah, that's correct. So one has to be very cautious about where he's going to end up. I notice it was not lost on many of us that he gave his speech in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus about the fall and also the administration that he's going to be implementing. So let me ask you a question. How despotic was the fallen al-Assad regime, in particular after the eruption of the Arab Spring in 2011?
Well, it had always been despotic, but the broad figures are after the so-called Arab Spring, when there was a brief moment when it looked as if there was going to be some opposition in the streets to Assad. Since that time, more than 500,000 have been killed, and 6 million Syrians have been displaced. Many certainly, but most of them to other countries on the border. A lot to Turkey, a lot to Iraq, a lot to Europe. Europe was flooded with Syrian refugees to the tune of 1 million or more in 2015, 2016. Notably, Germany welcomed hundreds of thousands into Germany. So that says a lot about the depredations of the Assad regime. Typically, the Assad Mukhabarat, or intelligence service, was pretty free to arrest, torture, and kill any opposition, and that's how they were able to maintain control. So on the one hand, they would place their Alawite brethren, tribal brethren, in positions of power. On the other hand, if you were a Syrian with any sense of opposition to the regime, you were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and killed, which was how they maintained control. And Assad had, if anything, he was more brutal than his father. He seemed like he might be somewhat more civilized, because his father was an Air Force general who conducted a coup, was part of the regime for 3 or 4 years before he became the president. His son studied medicine in the UK and became an ophthalmologist. I mean, a doctor who performed surgeries and treatment for eyes. Doesn't sound like somebody who would be a brutal dictator, but he was. And whether he did it because he was himself an unprincipled, brutal dictator, or he allowed himself to be co-opted by others whose methods were different than that of a medical doctor, it really doesn't matter. What happened was Bashar al-Assad was a terrible person who killed and maimed and tortured his own countrymen so he could retain power.
Well, now we find that al-Bashar and his beloved Rose of the Desert, Asma, and their children are ensconced essentially in Moscow, courtesy of Mr. Putin. But yet, as much as it's been estimated, they probably have stolen $2 billion worth of funds and put them in offshore accounts elsewhere in the world. They still have to live under sufferance to their benefactor, in this case, Mr. Putin. How long do you think that's going to last?
I'm surprised it's lasted any time. The Russian method of eliminating people that know too much is to take them off in an airplane and crash it, as we have seen. And when they first announced that Bashar al-Assad had flown out of Damascus, there was apparently a spurious report that the aircraft suddenly did a 180 turn back towards Syria and it disappeared off the screen. I heard that and I thought, oh, that sounds Russian to me. But then there's reports that he's in Moscow. Haven't seen him though. Is he still alive? I mean, there's a difference between killing Bashar al-Assad and killing off his wife, but not much. I mean, the Russians can do and will do whatever they find expedient. So I'm really kind of surprised that he's. What is the purpose of keeping him in Moscow except to drain the treasury of the Putin regime? Hard to know. But if I were Bashar al-Assad, I would not plan on a long life. What's the point of his being there? He's going to live well. I don't think Putin's a very, he's not interested in people that know bad things about him staying alive. I don't know how he's going to get out of that. I'm not sure. Maybe he could volunteer for a mission to Novozemya in the Arctic. It would be a good place for him to hang out for the next 2 or 3 years till he's finally dispatched. I don't think he's going to be alive that long, if he still is.
So what role did Russia play in essentially bucking up Bashar and his regime?
You know, Russia looked at the Assad regime as a foothold in the Middle East. They had a large air base there from which they flew missions in support of Syria and their conflicts in the Middle East with, among others, the United States. We have troops in southeastern Syria. I think we have 500 or so, but a lot of contractors too, some of whom carry weapons. There are Turks in Syria. There are Kurds all over northeastern Syria because that's the Kurdish homeland. And of course, there's the whole Hezbollah, Iran axis there that has used the Syrian facilities in Damascus and other cities as a land bridge of getting weapons, equipment, and personnel into Lebanon. So the idea that the Russians would support that is just, I don't want to say it's good, that's not the right word maybe, but it's effective geopolitics, and Russia took full advantage of that. They had a large air base on the coast near Latakia. They had a major naval installation at Tartus in near Latakia, northwestern Syria. For a good almost 20 years, they've been in and out of Syria with their military, doing whatever they think they need to do. And so it was a midway point for Russian adventures in Africa and the Middle East. Served a very good purpose for them. But it's, they're not, I don't think they're going to be able to keep any of those assets or any of that infrastructure. Hard to know. Maybe that's something that the Russians are going to try to work out. I'm sure they will try to work out with the new regime, but certainly they can't rely on their connections with Assad to do that. We shall see. But there was a very effective geopolitical place for them to be. Syria.
But you're correct. Russia doesn't have very attractive options at this point. No. Because of my work in doing analysis in Sudan, there was a 25-year deal that was signed to build a Russian base essentially on the Red Sea coast in Sudan. And given the civil war that's gone on since April of 23, with resurrection of essentially genocide against the Darfurians and others, I don't see that becoming a reality.
No.
So Russia is really in a very hard place in terms of achieving its reach out, so to speak, in terms of activities both in Africa and elsewhere at this point. It's still preoccupied with the horrible war in the Ukraine.
Yes. And that's their primary interest. Syria is like way down the list of places for them to concern themselves with compared to Ukraine.
So let's ask some questions or topics. How significant do you believe the Israeli destruction of Hamas in Gaza and the weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon was in launching this rebel takeover?
Well, I think we don't give the Israelis enough credit, not necessarily for directly fomenting al-Jolani's efforts, because we don't know. I suspect the Israelis have ties with al-Jolani, but it's hard to know. Even if they don't, they have inspired this by weakening Hezbollah, by weakening Iran, by standing up to the Iranian ring of fire around Israel. So it gave hope, if nothing else, to al-Jolani and the disparate group of rebels who opposed Assad that something to be done. I mean, they saw in Lebanon, Hezbollah literally decapitated, literally weakened. They saw Iran, the major sponsor of Assad, weakened by Israel. I mean, this is due to Israel's fight, and I'll be honest. I don't think the U.S. has played a very positive role in that. I think we've tried to slow the Israelis down. I think we've made it really hard for them to go after not just in Gaza, to finish the fight in Gaza, but also Hezbollah, also Iran. I mean, we've constantly asked them, don't, the word don't that our president has used over and over again. I think the don't was directed at Israel as much as it was to anybody else. In other words, let's de-escalate this. No, let's not de-escalate this. Let's fight this. Let's do this. Let's get this done. And I think Israel is blessed in the sense that not only are they determined, but they have been very fortunate to have the rebels in Syria take out Assad, which is a double-edged sword for Israel. I mean, one of the little known facts about the Assad regime is that it was stable. It was a graveyard situation for the people of Syria, but it meant that they weren't going to attack Israel. Again, the double-edged sword. The bad news is that he's a terrible guy who would have no qualms about killing Jews and destroying Israel. None. Assad would do that if he thought he could. But the good news was that he kept everybody else he was so oppressive that his main fight was not on the borders of Israel, and that border with Syria along the Golan Heights was the quietest part of the region, because the Syrians weren't going to attack. They saw what happened in 1973, where the Israelis got within 20 kilometers of Damascus and could have gone further if they had decided to, but they decided, no, we don't want to do that. We want to stabilize this front. We got enough on our plate. Let's end the war, and they did. And so after that, the Syrians were like, no, we're not going to do that. So Jerry, I know you've probably been on the border between the Golan and Syria. I have too. I've seen Syrian troops across the border at Quneitra. They're there. They were there, and they're not there anymore because the Israelis have now occupied that region that's just across the border with Syria. Thank goodness, Baruch Hashem. But it was quiet. There was no firing. There was occasional fighting, but nothing serious.
Certainly the UN forces who've been there since, May of 1974 in the buffer zone, breathed a sigh of relief because the Israelis came to their rescue.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. So Quneitra was quiet. The border area there was nothing happening there, nothing serious. As we know, even the northern part of the Golan, Majd al-Shams, is a Druze community who, they still fly the Syrian flag because a lot of the older people there grew up under Syria. They don't care about Assad. They care about being Syrian, and they speak Syrian Arabic. They don't, some of them don't want to be Israelis. I think most of the younger generations want to be Israeli. I mean, they're smart, but the older generation, we're Syrians, we speak Syrian, Arabic, they still identify. Today, even after this taking down of Assad, there's still Syrian flags flying in al-Shams, this town in the northern part of the Golan. But bottom line is, the Syrian border was quiet, stable. That's now that's why the Israelis have crossed. They've sent troops into Syria along the border, not just temporarily, which is being mischaracterized. Oh, they want to capture territory.
Yeah.
No, they don't. The Israel Defense Forces do not want to capture Syria. They're not interested in governing. They're interested in invasion. They're interested in quieting things down and preventing anybody from misusing this opportunity to carry on actions.
And yet, within the last couple of days, the IAF has been busy destroying essentially what were the military assets of the al-Bashar regime, preventing them from falling into the hands of essentially the Salafist rebels, so to speak. You've seen attacks by Israeli Navy missile boats at the port of Latakia to destroy what were naval assets of the Syrian government. You've also seen bombing of airfields throughout Syria, destroying aircraft and helicopters. You've also seen essentially bombings strategically and importantly of both the chemical factories that were the source of the problems of the horrible events in Ghouta and elsewhere. And as you and I have discussed it, people have not really realized it. They've also attacked the Syrian Scientific Research Center, which is not far from Damascus. But that's strategic. Why? Because it had been the locus of development of bioweapons of the al-Assad regime. And that's been identified, in my experience in writing about it, as far back as 2007, and it went back further after the evacuation from Iraq, in many ways, of these bioweapon precursors. So I think that's been essentially a positive sign.
Yeah.
One of the things that I mentioned at the outset of this conversation that is troubling is essentially the role of Turkey as a predator, essentially in Syria at the present time. And in particular, it has to deal with the Kurds in the northeast of the country, certain actions taken within the last 24 hours, in particular, the potential loss of Manbij on the western bank of the Euphrates River that had previously been protected by the mixed force of the Syrian Democratic Force, as well as a small U.S. detachment. And it's yes.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, it is as a friend, Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute, wrote this past week, showtime for the U.S. to essentially stand up in the context of protecting the Kurds. And that's been something that the new Israeli foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, and even yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu went to the forum. How that plays out, we don't know. But there is treachery there inherent in what Erdogan is trying to do in Syria. I noticed that it was not lost on many that the commander of CENTCOM met with the commander of the SDF force yesterday. And I'm sure it's to resurrect what the U.S. has. U.S. has what, about not quite 1,000 troops in that country, and I think many of them were there to assist in, quote, the war against ISIS,
That's the idea.
I recall.
Yes, you're right.
What
Yeah, I
about
think General
those?
Kurila is obviously on top of this. I hope that Blinken is not. Blinken has been a disaster, and Sullivan has been a disaster. But I hope General Kurila, who is a U.S. Army four-star general, who's got 35 years of service, he's not a politician, and he will do his best to try to keep U.S. national security interests at heart. And I'm sure he is. But I think the closer that our military is to the Kurds, the less likely Turkey is to attack them, and the more that they'll know the U.S. has their back. So it was a good meeting yesterday with the commander of U.S. Central Command.
Correct. But Turkey has always been a conundrum because it's what? A member of NATO, and yet it's been a supporter of Islamist causes all over the place. It's currently providing housing for, quote, Hamas leaders, I gather, in Ankara. And it's also perpetrating these actions through something called the new Syrian army.
Yeah. Well,
and
here's another interesting and complicating factor, that the majority population of the major city of southern Turkey is Antakya. The major population there is ethnically Alawite, and not well known outside of Turkey. But if you go to Antakya, as I have,
Yep.
you're gonna meet a lot of Alawites with sympathies for the Assad regime. Turkey has walked a very fine line with Assad and his family because of that. So now that the Assad family is out of power, it'll be interesting to see what Turkey does with its Alawite population in Antakya. They're probably not going to deport all the Alawites in Antakya. I don't know why they would. They're the major population there, probably 800,000 or so in that region of Turkey. And almost as many Alawites in Turkey as there are in Syria. So it really complicates things ethnically. And we know there's no sympathy in Turkey for the Kurds. So they will use this opportunity to attack the Kurds where they can. Not only just to attack them, but to destroy them and exterminate them if they can. There's no love lost between Turkish people and Kurdish people. I mean, it's really an ethnic enmity. So we're watching what Turkey's doing today, which they've crossed the border. Turkish military forces are in Syria as we speak, conducting attacks. We don't know how that's going to be resolved. And the Turkish military, yes, part of NATO. Are they on the same level as the United States as part of NATO? No, but they have a formidable military. They have huge ground forces, huge air forces. They have Navy's not really a factor in this case, but ground and air forces, they have very sophisticated and large ground and air forces. So let's hope that the visit of General Kurila to the Syrian Democratic Front and to the Kurdish commanders will deter Turkey from taking decisive action to hurt the Kurds and the Kurdish population.
You know, the ultimate problem is Tehran. And there have been reports that even within the IRGC, there have been cross-finger wars about who to blame for this latest fall of actors in the axis of resistance at this point in time. And that raises the question about what to do about their announced ramp up of uranium enrichment. There are circles both here in the United States not necessarily connected with the Trump administration, but a few who probably are, that it may be time to take out those nuclear facilities, that this may be the time to do it. If you've got disarray amongst the commanders, and we know that their air defense system was decimated by Israel, it would appear that this would be an opportune moment. The Biden administration has been only too loath to perpetuate the fantasy, false fantasy, about the JCOP approach to dealing with the Islamists in Tehran. But after this week, I don't think it's any longer a bar against doing something productive and also projective in this regard. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thought is that this is exactly the right time to take out the Iranian nuclear program completely, to destroy the facilities, to kill as many of the nuclear scientists as possible, or co-opt them, or do whatever you have to do to remove this threat, not just to the region, but to the world. Iran is a loose cannon on deck in the Middle East. And the reason it is because of this incipient nuclear capability, which is only more urgent for the mullahs now that they have no conventional capability. Their Ring of Fire dream has been shattered. They thought that the Ring of Fire might be a way to buy time to develop this nuclear capability. And now explicitly they're ramping it up. Well, I think it doesn't take a genius to think that the reason they're ramping it up is because this is their last line of survival. They believe if they have a nuclear capability like North Korea, they're immune against invasion. And I think now's the time to take that belief away from them by destroying the nuclear capability. And we shouldn't allow our ally Israel to do it alone. I mean, we may ask them to help, and they'd probably be happy to help, but we've got the capability, the strategic capability to remove the Iranian nuclear capability, and we should do it. We should do it now.
Well, we have U.S. aircraft that are quite capable of carrying the so-called mother of all bombs, the MOPR.
Yeah,
It's called.
Yeah, it's basically a super bunker buster.
Exactly.
They'll go literally several hundred feet underground to destroy very well camouflaged and protected bunkers. That's what's going to be needed to do this. But I think now is the best time for us to do that. I know the Biden administration is not planning on doing that because that's not how they behave. They don't believe in that. But I think if they do, Baruch Hashem, let's hope that they do. I think the new administration is probably hoping that they will, because then it'll remove this huge problem from their first few days. But I think if the Biden administration doesn't do this with our ability, and unfortunately, it's going to take a very senior level decision, not Biden, but people around him who tell him what to do. It's going to take a very senior level decision to make this attack. When Trump comes in office, day one, he'll probably order it. And I hope he does. This is the time. It should happen now, not the 20th of January. This is the most vulnerable time for the Iranians, and they're counting on they're counting on developing this capability as soon as possible. And we should remove it from the table. I hope we do.
Now, there are still activities going on in Gaza at this juncture. And it's mostly to take out the infrastructure for Hamas. One of the final things that has not been achieved is basically the rescue of the hostages. And it becomes increasingly apparent, as it has been throughout this entire process, that there is nobody that we can trust as an intermediary, whether it's the Egyptians or the Qataris, or even the US in this regard. And so at the end of the day, is it left to Israel itself to do that independently of all these actions?
Well, I think that with our current administration, you can't expect anything other than just discourage the Israelis from taking decisive action. And the Israelis, unfortunately, know that. They know we'll continue to send weapons and equipment and make rhetorical support, but they're not gonna do anything. We the US aren't gonna do anything positive to help Israel with this problem. But they also have the expectation that that the Trump administration will. And as Trump has said, and I don't think he's kidding, there'll be hell to pay in the Middle East if the hostages aren't released by the time he becomes president. And I think I think what hell to pay means is we may actually help the Israelis with special operations forces, and that would be good. As opposed to send at the beginning of after October 7th, we sent a couple of American senior officers there to observe. They come back with hopefully some lessons learned, but they didn't do anything.
You would think that by this time, given what the IDF has done in Gaza, they should have a pretty good idea of where those people are located.
I think they do. I think they do. I don't know. Obviously, nobody knows that unless they're inside the intelligence security establishment, which I'm not. But having worked in that establishment a long time, I know how they work, and they're not going to tell where their success points are. They're just going to do what they do. But they're under orders right now to stay with the Biden administration's "don't" policy. And he didn't come up with that policy on his own. He was told, just say don't. Tell Israelis to back down and to take it easy. Shway shway, as they say in the region. Go easy. Which is Arabic, but it's all over Israel too. Shway shway means take it easy. Don't get so urgent here. But what needs to happen is that the United States needs to tell Israel, we have steadfast support for our ally Israel, which means we're going to make them coffee. We're going to give them resources. We're going to not say, oh, if you don't treat the humanitarian situation right, we're going to cut off your aid. That's crazy. What they need is complete, unfettered support for their military actions. And yes, there will be casualties, but guess what? The reason there are so many casualties is because this war has been going on. Right. So the sooner it's over, the better off everybody's going to be. Let's attack. Let Israel attack. Give them the resources. Let them do Gaza, whatever. Let's take the Houthis off their back. They don't need to be attacking Houthis. And let's take Iran off their back. Let's let them do it. Let's us take care of Iran and tell Israel, you worry about what's going on in your little area. We'll cover your back. That would be support. I hope we do that. And I think we will.
Finally, I'd like to pose a question to you.
Yes, sir.
Has Israel done a favor to the West by what it has done since October the 7th?
Yes, they have. The sad part, of course, is that there have been probably 1,600 Israelis killed, entire communities devastated, billions of Israeli resources committed to defend themselves. So there's a huge cost that we in the United States have a hard time seeing. So Israel has paid a huge price, but that price has been to defend all of us. This is a war of civilizations between the people of Israel and the West and the barbarians who attacked them on October 7th and all those who support those barbarians. And Israel has done a wonderful job conducting this as morally and effectively as they possibly can with the resources they have. And we must be grateful to them for having defended all of us against the civilizational enemy, the barbarians who attacked them on October 7th and continue to. So yes, Israel has done us all a great boon. by defending itself so effectively. And we owe the people of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces a tremendous debt of gratitude.
Thank you, General. It was a great ending.
Thank you, Jerry, my brother. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the opportunity to keep this dialogue going. We're constantly surprised by the events. If you'd have told me even a month ago that this would have been the thing we talked about, I'd go, not really, but it is. Baruch Hashem.